of warmth. She loved to laugh, teach people what she had learned in school, and try out new fashions.
Man, who shot her?
A murder that Kenneth will try to pin on the most defenseless person in the house, his own son.
What kind of father shoots his 14-year-old daughter and then frames his disabled son? Kenneth Farler III did exactly that on a Sunday morning in Dayton, Ohio. Kendra May Farler asked him to put the gun down. He laughed. Then he pulled the trigger. Minutes later, he was coaching his girlfriend on what to tell police. Blame Wyatt, the autistic boy who couldn't speak to defend himself. The events leading to this moment started hours earlier. Right before we dive in, leave a comment and tell me, what are you doing while you listen? Driving, working, cooking, or winding down? I read your comments more than you think. Some details are fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental. And the focus is the lesson. Kendra May Farler stood in her bedroom, holding a t-shirt up to the light. 14 years old, trying to decide what to wear on a Sunday morning in Dayton, Ohio. The fabric was soft between her fingers. She set it down and reached for another. It was April 14th, 2024, and the morning felt ordinary. The kind where time moved slowly and nothing seemed urgent. Kendra pulled a hoodie from the closet, considered it, put it back. Small choices that somehow mattered. Her mother. Jennifer Slorp was somewhere else in the house, 34, moving through rooms the way mothers do. Wyatt was there too. Kenneth Farler III's son, nonverbal and autistic, occupying his own quiet space. Greg Farler slept in another room, door closed, unaware of the morning unfolding. Kenneth himself was in the house. 39. His presence settled over everything like weather. Kendra noticed things. That was who she was. A girl who paid attention when others didn't. There was something in the air that morning. Something she couldn't name but felt. Tension that lived in the house without announcing itself. She'd tried to say something about it once, weeks ago. The adults had smiled and changed the subject. She chose a shirt and pulled it on. Her room filled with morning light, ordinary and warm. Keep that in mind. The things Kendra noticed. The warnings she tried to give. Downstairs. The house held its ordinary sounds. Footsteps, doors opening and closing, the hum of the refrigerator, Wyatt moving quietly, Jennifer's voice calling something Kendra couldn't quite hear. Kenneth, somewhere close. Greg still sleeping, removed from the geography of what was coming. Kendra ran her hand through her hair and looked at herself in the mirror. 14. A girl who loved teaching people what she learned, who saw things clearly, who tried to speak up about what felt wrong. No one was listening. The gun had been in the house for weeks. Not in Kendra's room. She didn't know where, but somewhere in this boarding house in Dayton. It had been there while she chose clothes and went to school and came home. Waiting. But right now, Kendra was just a girl standing in her room. The morning felt normal. The light was warm. She had no reason to think this would be the last time. The clock moved forward. 10 o'clock. Then 10:15, somewhere in the house. Kenneth Farler III was moving too. Time doesn't stop for what's coming. It just keeps going, carrying everyone forward whether they're ready or not. Kendra left her room and stepped into the hallway. The morning was still ordinary. The house was still quiet. The people in it still going about their Sunday unaware. Except Kendra had noticed something. She'd felt the wrongness. She'd tried to say it, and no one had listened. Kenneth Farler III stood in the boarding house with a shotgun in his hands. It was 10:30 in the morning. The house in Dayton, Ohio was quiet except for Kenneth. He was high. He'd been using drugs that morning, his pupils wide, his movements loose. The shotgun felt light in his grip. He pumped it. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5, 6. 6 times. That's how you make a gun safe. That's how you empty it. Kenneth was certain. He pumped the action 6 times, each movement deliberate, methodical. The metal slid smooth under his hands. He was laughing, relaxed. The gun was empty now. He knew it. Kendra saw him. She was 14 years old. Standing in that room, watching her father handle a shotgun while high. She saw the gun. She saw his hands. She saw the wrongness of it all. "Put it down," she said. Kenneth laughed. The sound was easy, dismissive. A kid telling him what to do. He was the adult. He knew how guns worked. He'd just pumped it 6 times. It was empty. Safe. "It's empty," he told her, still laughing. "I pumped it 6 times. Kendra didn't move. "Please, just put it down." He didn't. This is the moment to remember. Kendra saw the danger. Kendra spoke up. Kendra told him exactly what needed to happen. Put the gun down. Kenneth Farler III, 39 years old. High on drugs in the middle of a Sunday morning. Looked at his 14-year-old daughter and decided she didn't know what she was talking about. "I know what I'm doing," he said. The shotgun was in his hands. The one he'd pumped 6 times to make safe. The one that couldn't possibly fire. The gun fired. The sound was everything. Deafening. Final. The kind of sound that splits a morning in half before and after. Kendra fell. The shotgun Kenneth had pumped 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The gun he swore was empty had just put a round through his daughter's body. She was on the floor, blood spreading. 14 years old and bleeding in a boarding house in Dayton because her father didn't listen. Jennifer was there. Wyatt was there. The whole house shattered into chaos and screaming and the impossible reality of what had just happened. Kenneth stood holding the gun. His mind raced. He was high. Kendra was bleeding. The gun was in his hands, and smoke was still rising from the barrel. And he'd just shot his daughter, and the house was screaming, and he needed to. The phone. 911. Call for help. But even as panic flooded him, something else was moving in Kenneth's mind. Something cold and calculating. The story. What would he say? How would he explain this? The gun in his hands, Kendra on the floor, the house full of witnesses. By the time he dialed, the version of events was already shifting. By the time the dispatcher answered, the story had changed. Jennifer Slorp's hands shook as she dialed 911. Kendra was bleeding on the floor of the boarding house. The phone rang once, twice. Someone picked up. The dispatcher's voice was calm, trained, asking the necessary questions. "What's your emergency? Where are you? What happened? Is she breathing?" Jennifer tried to answer, tried to form words. Her daughter was 14 years old and shot and bleeding, and she needed to say something. Anything. But the question that came, the one that mattered most, froze her completely. Who shot her? Jennifer couldn't speak. Her daughter was bleeding, and the gun had been in Kenneth's hands, and she didn't know how to say what had happened, how to explain it. Panic swallowed the words before they could form. "I don't," she started. "I can't." Kenneth took the phone from her hand. The dispatcher didn't know what had just shifted. Didn't know a different voice was on the line now. She repeated the question. Professional and steady. "Sir, who shot the girl?" Kenneth answered immediately. No hesitation. No pause to think or process or weigh his words. "My son," he said. Wyatt, his autistic, nonverbal son, the boy who couldn't speak. The boy who couldn't defend himself against an accusation Kenneth knew he couldn't refute. He didn't hesitate, not for a second. Think about that. The gun had been in Kenneth's hands. He'd pumped it 6 times. Laughing. Certain it was empty. Kendra had told him to put it down. He'd ignored her and pulled the trigger and shot his daughter. All of that had just happened. Minutes ago. The smoke hadn't even cleared, and Kenneth Farler III picked up the phone and blamed Wyatt. Does that sound like a man in shock? Or a man who'd already decided which story to tell? The dispatcher took down the information. A child shot in a boarding house in Dayton, Ohio. The shooter identified as another child in the home. Emergency responders were dispatched immediately. Sirens already wailing, racing toward a scene Kenneth had just defined for them. They thought they knew what they'd find. A tragic accident. A child with a gun. But there's something else. Something that happened 4 days earlier that changes everything. On April 10, 2024, a warrant was issued for Kenneth Farler III's arrest. He'd violated parole. The paperwork was filed. The order was official. Kenneth was supposed to be taken into custody. Nobody came to the door. The warrant sat there. Documented. Legal. Unserved. If someone had knocked on that door in Dayton. If someone had arrested Kenneth on April 10th, he wouldn't have been in that boarding house on April 14th. He wouldn't have been high with a shotgun in his hands. He wouldn't have shot his daughter. Kendra would be alive. But nobody served it. 4 days. That's all the time between the system identifying Kenneth as a threat and Kenneth shooting his daughter. The warrant was there. The authority was there. The power to remove him from that house was there. Nobody knocked on the door of the boarding house in Dayton, Ohio. Nobody served it. The warrant that should have stopped Kenneth was never served. But the emergency call he made was answered immediately. The police were already running into the house. They burst through the door of the boarding house in Dayton, Ohio, responding to a shooting. A child had been shot. Another child, an autistic boy, had allegedly pulled the trigger. That's what the 911 dispatcher had relayed. That's what the responding officers believed they were walking into. Kendra was on the floor, bleeding. They saw the gun nearby. They saw Kenneth and Jennifer. They saw the chaos of a house shattered by violence. "Where's the boy?" one officer asked. Kenneth answered immediately. "My son Wyatt. He didn't know it was loaded." The officers took in the scene. A tragic accident. A child with a gun. An autistic boy who didn't understand what he'd done. That's what Kenneth's story painted. That's what they saw. Paramedics rushed in behind them. They dropped to the floor beside Kendra. 14 years old. Shot. Bleeding. They began CPR immediately. Chest compressions. Steady and rhythmic. Trying to bring her back. Breaths. Compressions. The mechanical rhythm of trying to save a life. Jennifer was screaming. Kenneth was watching. Wyatt was somewhere in the house. Unaware that his father had just named him as the shooter. Unaware that he'd been accused of something he couldn't defend himself against because he couldn't speak. The paramedics worked. Compressions. Breaths. Compressions. The blood kept spreading. They were losing her. Kendra May Farler, who'd stood in her room that morning choosing clothes, who'd noticed the wrongness in the house, who'd told Kenneth to put the gun down, who'd seen the danger and tried to warn him. She was dying on the floor while paramedics fought to pull her back. Then the door opened again. Kendra's grandmother walked in holding containers of food. She'd brought lunch for the family. She was smiling, calling out as she stepped through the doorway, "I brought lunch." The words died. She saw the police. She saw the paramedics on the floor. She saw the blood. She saw her granddaughter, 14 years old, on the floor, with people doing CPR and blood everywhere, and Kenneth standing there and Jennifer screaming. The food was still in her hands. Containers of lunch she'd brought for an ordinary Sunday, for a normal family meal. She'd had no idea, no warning, no way to prepare for walking through that door and seeing her granddaughter shot and bleeding and dying. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was seeing. The paramedics kept working. Compressions, breaths, desperate attempts to save Kendra. The police were taking statements, trying to understand what had happened. Kenneth was still telling his story. The boy, the accident, the gun. And Kendra's grandmother stood in the doorway of the boarding house in Dayton, Ohio. The food was still in her hands. Containers of lunch she'd brought for the family. Her granddaughter was on the floor. Paramedics working. Blood spreading. And she couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't let go of the food. The food containers had fallen from her hands. Now the grandmother's grief was the only real sound. She was outside in the front yard of the boarding house, weeping, uncontrollable, raw. Her granddaughter was dead, taken away by paramedics who couldn't save her. The food was gone, but her hands still shook. This is what real grief looks like. No performance, no calculation, just the shattering reality of a child lost. Nearby, Kenneth Farler III stood holding his youngest daughter. She was crying, confused, trying to understand what had happened to her sister. Kenneth pulled her close. "Your sister is gone," he told her. The girl sobbed. Kenneth held her tighter. "I need you to be strong for me," he said. Not for herself, not for her family, for him. He needed her to be strong for him. Watch his face. Listen to his voice. This wasn't a father comforting a grieving child. This was Kenneth positioning himself at the center of the tragedy, demanding strength from a child who just lost her sister. Grief as theater. Sympathy as currency. Who was this performance for? The police were still processing the scene. The neighbors who'd heard the sirens. Anyone watching. Kenneth was already building the image of a devastated father. Strong. Protective. Holding his family together in the face of tragedy. The grandmother kept weeping. Her grief needed no audience. Across the yard, Wyatt sat in the grass, silent. He was always silent. Autistic, nonverbal, living in his own world. But now people were watching that silence differently, reading meaning into it, reading guilt. No one approached him. No one tried to communicate with him. No one asked what he'd seen or heard or understood. They just watched. His father had named him as the shooter. His silence couldn't refute it. It couldn't defend. It couldn't explain. The silence just sat there, heavy and damning, while Kenneth held his youngest daughter and performed grief, and the grandmother wept for real. Kendra was gone, shot by her father. And the boy who couldn't speak was being blamed. Inside the boarding house, Across the hallway. Behind the other door. Greg Farler was waking up. He'd been asleep when the gun fired. Asleep when Kenneth pumped the shotgun 6 times. Asleep when Kendra told Kenneth to put it down.
He didn't mean to do it. I know he didn't mean to do it. He don't understand. He don't know any better.
Asleep when Kenneth made the 911 call and blamed Wyatt. Greg hadn't heard any of it. Hadn't been part of Kenneth's story. Hadn't been consulted when Kenneth decided to frame the shooting as an accident in Greg's room with Greg's gun. But he was awake now. The sirens had pulled him from sleep. The chaos in the house had dragged him into consciousness. He was waking up to police and paramedics and blood, and his brother Kenneth telling a story Greg hadn't been there to hear. He was awake now. Greg was awake, but no one had come to ask him anything yet. They were busy with Jennifer. Jennifer Slorp sat in the back of the police cruiser parked outside the boarding house. The detective investigating Kendra's shooting slid into the seat beside her, notepad ready. She was Kendra's mother, a witness. Devastated. They needed to know what she'd seen. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked. Jennifer nodded, took a breath, composed herself, began to speak. "It was Wyatt," she said. "He found the gun." The detective wrote it down. An autistic child, a gun, a tragedy. He asked her to continue. "Tell him everything." Jennifer told him the story. It happened in Greg's room. Greg Farler, Kenneth's brother, lived in the boarding house with them. The gun belonged to Greg. Wyatt must have found it there, in that room. He didn't understand what it was. He didn't know it was loaded. He pulled the trigger. "It was in Greg's room," Jennifer said. "Greg's gun." The detective kept writing, taking it all down. "Wyatt didn't know it was loaded," she continued. The story came out steady, detailed, clear. No hesitation. A tragic accident. An autistic boy who couldn't comprehend the danger of what he was holding. A gun that shouldn't have been accessible to a child. A family shattered by a terrible, terrible mistake. It matched Kenneth's account. Perfectly. Word for word. Think about that. Kenneth had given his statement first, high on drugs. His daughter bleeding on the floor. Chaos and screaming everywhere around him. Then Jennifer gave hers separately. Sitting in the back of a police cruiser, grief-stricken and shaking, away from Kenneth. 2 independent witnesses. 2 separate interviews. Different locations. Different emotional states. The same story. The same details. The same sequence of events. Greg's room. Greg's gun. Wyatt found it. Wyatt pulled the trigger. He didn't know it was loaded. 2 supposedly independent accounts that aligned perfectly. Detail for detail. That's what the detective was hearing. That's what he was writing down in his notepad. False corroboration. The most dangerous kind of lie. When 2 people tell the same story independently, investigators believe it. Why wouldn't they? Coordinated lies are hard to maintain under pressure. Details slip. Timelines shift. Stories drift apart when people are questioned separately. But Kenneth and Jennifer's stories didn't drift. They matched. Perfectly. The detective finished writing. He had what he needed. 2 witnesses, mother and father, both devastated. Same story. An autistic child. A tragic accident. A gun from another resident's room. The initial picture was complete. The case seemed closed before it had even really begun. Kendra was dead. Wyatt was the shooter. It was Greg's gun from Greg's room. Tragic, horrible, but clear. The detective closed his notepad. The story was documented. Wyatt couldn't refute it. He was nonverbal. couldn't defend himself, couldn't tell his side. Greg was just waking up. He hadn't been consulted, hadn't been part of the story. Kenneth and Jennifer had given their statements. The narrative was set. They had a room, a gun, and an owner. Two were about to belong to someone else. The detective opened the closet door in Greg's room and found an empty rack. The gun was missing. The room, the gun, and the owner matched Kenneth's story. But Greg hadn't been asked yet. The officers needed to talk to Wyatt. Wyatt Farler sat on the couch downstairs. 16 years old. Silent. Still. Two witnesses said he pulled the trigger. The officers needed to hear it from him. One of them knelt down. "Can you tell us what happened?" Wyatt didn't answer. His hands rested on his knees. He looked at the floor, not at the officer. The officer tried again. "Did you find the gun? Did you pick it up?" Nothing. No words. No nod. The officer glanced at his partner. Kenneth stepped closer. "He can't talk. He's never been able to." The officer stood up. "He's nonverbal. Autistic," Kenneth said. His voice was steady, helpful. "He doesn't speak. Never has." The officer looked down at Wyatt again. The boy accused of shooting his sister couldn't tell them whether he did it, couldn't say where he found the gun, couldn't explain what happened before the shot, couldn't tell them what his father had been doing with the shotgun. The second officer wrote something in his notebook. The first asked Kenneth if Wyatt could communicate another way. Ken said sometimes, but not when he was upset, not when he was overwhelmed. And he was overwhelmed now. The officers stepped back. They couldn't question someone who couldn't answer. Kenneth had known that when he said Wyatt's name on the 911 call. He had known it when he told Jennifer what to say. He had known it when the police arrived.
God, no, she's not! No, she's not! No, she's not!
He couldn't speak. Kenneth Farler III had blamed the one person in the house who could not refute the accusation. Not Jennifer, who might crack under questioning. Not Greg, who owned the gun. Not the younger daughter, who saw what happened. Wyatt, the boy who had no words to fight back with. The boy who couldn't tell the officers his father had been holding the shotgun, that his father pumped it 6 times, that his father laughed when Kendra asked him to put it down, that his father handed him the gun only after Kendra was already on the floor. Wyatt sat silent, and Kenneth stood beside him, playing the worried father. This is what a calculated frame looks like. You don't blame the person most likely to have done it. You blame the person least able to deny it. The officers looked at each other. There was nothing more to learn here. They couldn't build a case on silence. They needed words, statements. Wyatt couldn't give them that, so they turned toward the stairs. Greg Farler had been upstairs when the shot was fired. His room, his gun, his closet. Now empty. Wyatt Farler sat silent because Wyatt Farler had no other choice. Kenneth Farler III knew that when he named him, so they went to the other door. Greg Farler sat across from the officers. They had questions about his gun, about his room, about what he'd heard that morning. He'd been asleep when the gun went off. He woke to the sound. By the time he got downstairs, Kendra was on the floor and Kenneth was on the phone with 911. The officers nodded. They needed to confirm the details. One of them leaned forward. "You were in your room when the gun discharged." "I was asleep when I heard it." "And the shooting happened in your room, is that correct?" Greg looked at him confused. "No, I was in my room, across the hall." The officer paused. "I'm sorry, which room?" "My bedroom is the other door, across the hall." The officer glanced at his partner, then back at Greg. "The room where the shooting occurred "That's not your bedroom." "No," Greg said. "That's not my room." The second officer flipped back through his notes. Kenneth Farler III had told them the shooting happened in Greg's room, that Wyatt had found Greg's gun in Greg's room, that Greg kept the shotgun in his closet, in his room, where the shooting occurred. Jennifer Slorp had said the same thing. Greg's gun, Greg's room, both of them, the exact same story. But Greg's bedroom was across the hall. The officers stood. They walked back to the room where Kendra had been shot. They looked at the closet, the empty gun rack, the floor where she'd fallen. Then they walked across the hall to Greg's actual bedroom. Different door, different room, different closet. Kenneth and Jennifer had both said the shooting happened in Greg's room. They'd both said Wyatt found the gun there. They'd both placed the crime in the wrong location. The other door. Geography is evidence. The physical layout of a house doesn't lie. It doesn't change its story under pressure. It doesn't coordinate with anyone. Kenneth had told the officers that Wyatt found the gun in Greg's room. Jennifer had backed him up. But the shooting didn't happen in Greg's room. It happened across the hall. If Kenneth told them the wrong room, did he do it by mistake? Or did he do it because the truth would have exposed him? Because saying Greg's room meant saying Greg's gun, which meant pointing away from himself. But the gun wasn't in Greg's room. The shooting wasn't in Greg's room. So whose room was it? And whose gun was it, really? The officers walked back downstairs.
We gotta stay strong, man.
You're good.
We have to stay strong.
He looked up when the officers came down the stairs. He asked if they'd talked to Greg, if Greg had told them about the gun. They said yes. They'd talked to Greg, and Greg had told them about the room. Kenneth Farler III told police the shooting happened in Greg's room with Greg's gun. Jennifer Slorp said the same. But Greg Farler's bedroom was across the hall, if the room wasn't Greg's. Nothing they'd been told was true. The officers were done listening to Kenneth Farler III. His story about Greg's room had fallen apart the moment Greg told them which room was actually his. Nothing he told them was true. They needed to separate him from everyone he'd been using to tell his lie. Kenneth stood in the front yard, still holding his youngest daughter. He'd been holding her since the ambulance left, holding her close, whispering to her, keeping her pressed against him while he performed his grief. She was 6 years old, and she'd been his prop for hours. Not anymore. One of the officers stepped forward. "We need to speak with you both downtown." Another officer reached for the little girl. Kenneth's arms tightened around her for a moment, then let go. She was led away, toward a neighbor, away from him. The performance was over. Kenneth stood alone in the yard, with no one to hide behind. Kenneth and Jennifer were placed in separate cars, separate seats, separate doors closing. The lie had collapsed with one sentence about room geography. Now came the unraveling. Before we show you what Jennifer said in that room, comment A if you think she'll tell the truth, or B if you think she'll stay loyal to Kenneth. Add one reason why. Quick note, the next part includes some recreated details to capture the emotional truth. Separate cars. Separate stories about to emerge. They were driven to the Dayton police station, Kenneth in one vehicle, Jennifer in another. He couldn't see her, couldn't coach her, couldn't remind her what to say. For the first time since the shooting, Jennifer was alone with what she'd seen and what she'd been told to say about it. At the station, the detective made a choice. He could start with Kenneth, the father, the one who'd built the lie and named his own son. Or he could start with Jennifer, the mother, the one who'd watched her daughter bleed out on the floor The one who'd repeated Kenneth's story perfectly, but whose hands had been shaking the entire time. Jennifer first. She was the weak point in the coordinated lie. Kendra was her daughter, not Kenneth's pawn. The detective knew grief could be manipulated, but it could also break through lies, particularly when the liar was separated from the person who'd told her what to say. They took Jennifer into the interrogation room. Ken waited in another room, behind another door, losing control of the narrative he'd spent all morning building. He couldn't see her, couldn't signal her, couldn't stop what was about to happen. Jennifer Slorp sat across from the detective in the interrogation room at the Dayton police station. Her daughter, Kendra May, was dead. Her story matched Kenneth's perfectly. Too perfectly. The detective knew Jennifer was the weak point in the coordinated lie. It would take her less than a minute. The detective didn't ask Jennifer what happened. He already knew most of it. The lie had fallen apart with Greg's simple statement about which room was his. Now came the question of whether Jennifer would admit the truth or cling to Kenneth's script one more time. He sat across from her in the interrogation room at the Dayton police station. Jennifer looked exhausted. Her eyes were red. Her hands shook. The detective leaned forward. "I know what happened in that house." Jennifer looked up at him, but said nothing. "Kenneth shot your daughter. Then he told you to say Wyatt did it. He gave you the story about Greg's room, Greg's gun. He coached you before the police arrived. I know all of this." Jennifer's breathing quickened. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. "I'm giving you one chance to be honest. One chance to tell me the truth about what Kenneth did. This is the only time I'm offering this." The detective didn't need to threaten her. He didn't need to promise leniency or immunity. He just needed to separate her from Kenneth and give her permission to stop lying. That's all it ever took with the weak link in a coordinated story. Jennifer stared at the table. The detective watched her. Her daughter had been dead for hours. She was sitting in a police interrogation room, and her pupils were still dilated. The detective had seen this before. Grief looked a certain way. Shock looked a certain way. Chemical influence looked different. Jennifer's eyes told him she'd been high when the shooting happened. And she was still high now, hours later. As the drugs worked their way out of her system, and reality came crashing back in, her pupils were still wide. Whatever she'd taken that morning had kept her numb through the immediate aftermath. It had let Kenneth tell her what to say, and she'd repeated it because she couldn't process what had actually happened. But the numbness was fading now. The interrogation room was quiet and cold and real. Kenneth wasn't there to remind her what to say, and Jennifer was starting to feel everything she'd been chemically avoiding for the last few hours. The detective waited. He didn't push. He didn't fill the silence. He just let Jennifer sit with the weight of what she knew, and what she'd said, and what her daughter's death meant. Jennifer started to cry. Then she started to talk. Kenneth did it. The detective nodded. "Tell me what you saw." He had the gun. He was holding it. He pumped it, and Kendra asked him to put it down. He laughed. Then he shot her. And then what happened? He told me to say it was Wyatt. He told me Wyatt found the gun in Greg's room. He told me exactly what to say before we called 911. The truth poured out. Every detail, every lie Kenneth had constructed, every word he'd fed her. Jennifer confessed it all. The detective said it would take less than a minute for Jennifer to break. He was right. She did not use the whole minute. Jennifer Slorp started talking. The detective had said it would take less than a minute for her to break. She'd used 37 seconds. Now the confession poured out. Every detail she'd been holding back since the moment Kenneth told her what to say. Kenny did it. The detective leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what you saw." "Kenny's gun. Kenny pulled the trigger. It wasn't Wyatt. It wasn't Greg's gun in Greg's room. It was Kenny. Jennifer's voice cracked as she said his name. Kenneth Farler III. The man she'd been living with. The father of her daughter. The man who'd just shot Kendra and then told Jennifer to blame his autistic son who couldn't speak to defend himself. She named him. She gave the detective everything. The detective asked what happened before the shot. Jennifer told him. Kenneth had the shotgun. He was holding it in the boarding house. He pumped it 6 times. He said it was empty. Kendra was there. She saw what her father was doing. Kendra told him to put it down. The detective stopped writing. What did she say? She said, "Put it down." Those were Kendra May Farler's last words. Not a cry for help. Not a scream. A warning. A plea. She saw the danger before anyone else in that house. She saw her father with the gun. Saw him pumping it. Saw him pointing it. And she told him to stop. She asked him to put it down. She was 14 years old. And she was the only one who saw what was about to happen. The only one who tried to stop it. And no one listened. The detective asked what Kenneth did when Kendra said that. Jennifer looked down at the table. Her hands were shaking. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. He was laughing. He was laughing. Kenneth Farler III had the shotgun in his hands. His 14-year-old daughter was telling him to put it down. And he thought it was funny. He laughed. He told her it was empty. He told her he'd pumped it 6 times. He told her there was nothing to worry about. And then he pulled the trigger. Jennifer told the detective all of it. The shot, Kendra falling, the blood, Kenneth handing the gun to Wyatt after, Kenneth telling Jennifer exactly what to say before they called 911, Kenneth coaching her while their daughter was dying on the floor. Every word of the lie. Every detail of the truth. The detective asked if Jennifer understood that Kenneth had killed Kendra. Jennifer nodded. She understood. She'd understood it the moment it happened. She just hadn't been allowed to say it until now. 2 rooms away in the same police station, Kenneth Farler III sat in his own interrogation room. Officers were asking him the same questions. What happened? Who had the gun? Who pulled the trigger? Kenneth gave them the same answers he'd been giving since the morning. I never touched the gun. Wyatt did it. I never touched it. Jennifer Slorp had just named Kenneth Farler III as the shooter, confessed the coordinated lie, and repeated Kendra's last desperate warning. 2 rooms away. Kenneth was still claiming he never touched the gun. The detective walked into Kenneth's interrogation room. Kenneth Farler III looked up. He'd been sitting there for an hour, telling the same story. Wyatt did it. Greg's gun. Greg's room. He thought the lie was holding. The detective sat down across from him. Your wife told me everything. Kenneth's hands gripped the edge of the table. Jennifer said you shot Kendra. She said you coached her on what to say. She said you blamed Wyatt, your own son, a boy who can't even speak to defend himself. Kenneth shook his head. She's confused. She's in shock. She doesn't know what she's saying. She knows exactly what she's saying. She told me Kendra's last words. She told me you were laughing. She told me you handed the gun to Wyatt after you shot your daughter. Kenneth looked away. His jaw tightened. The detective waited. Either Kenneth would break, or he'd cling to the lie even knowing it had collapsed. The boy shouldn't have. The detective leaned forward. Even now. Kenneth was still trying to blame Wyatt, still calling him the boy, still deflecting. The boy is 16 years old, autistic, and nonverbal. He can't tell anyone what really happened. You knew that when you named him. You picked the one person in that house who couldn't fight back. Kenneth said nothing. You blamed him because you thought no one would ever hear his side of the story. But Jennifer heard it. And now I've heard it. So it's over, Kenneth. The detective sat back. He'd seen men like Kenneth before. Men who hurt the people closest to them and then spent all their energy constructing lies instead of facing what they'd done. Men who would sacrifice anyone, even their own children, to avoid accountability. Be a man. It's time to be a man, Kenneth. Time to tell the truth. Time to own what you did to Kendra May. Kenneth stared at the table. His breathing was shallow. His hands were shaking. The detective waited. Silence was a tool. Kenneth had been holding the lie together for hours. Now it was falling apart. Kenneth spoke quietly. I pulled the trigger. The detective nodded. Tell me what happened. I had the gun. The shotgun. I pumped it 6 times. 6 times to make it safe. To make sure there was nothing in the chamber. I was being careful. Listen to how he tells it. He pumped the gun to make it safe. He was being responsible. Checking to ensure it was empty. That's the frame. That's the story within the confession. And then what happened? The gun fired. I pulled the trigger and the gun fired. Where was Kendra when you pulled the trigger? Kenneth didn't answer that question. He admitted the gun. He admitted the trigger. He admitted the shot. He never admitted aiming it at his daughter. He never admitted pointing the shotgun at her.
What? No, absolutely not. My bedroom's the other door.
No, I know he had the gun, but she was telling him to put it down, and he was laughing at her or something.
And admitted he pulled the trigger of the shotgun that killed his 14-year-old daughter, Kendra May. He described pumping it 6 times to ensure it was safe. He admitted pulling the trigger. He never admitted pointing it at her. Kenneth Farler III had more to say. He'd admitted pulling the trigger. He'd admitted the gun was in his hands. But there was more he needed the detective to know. More pieces of the story he wanted to control. I never pointed it at her. The detective looked at him across the table. Kenneth had just confessed to killing his daughter, and now he was explaining that it wasn't really his fault. The gun fired. Yes. His finger pulled the trigger. Yes. But he never aimed it at Kendra. That detail mattered to him. I tried to save her. I did chest compressions. I called 911. I held her. I tried everything. Listen to how he tells it. In the same breath as denying he pointed the gun, Kenneth describes his heroic rescue attempts. He confesses the trigger and performs the grieving father simultaneously. He killed her and tried to save her. He shot her and loved her. The two things exist side by side in his version, as if one cancels out the other. The detective had seen this before. Men who hurt people and then wrap themselves in the role of victim or savior. Kenan wasn't confessing. He was narrating a tragedy where he was both the cause and the hero. Where the gun fired, Kendra fell. And he did everything he could to bring her back. Where pumping the shotgun 6 times was safety, not recklessness. Where pulling the trigger was accident, not intent. I never wanted this to happen. No one ever does. But Kendra still asked him to put the gun down, and he still laughed. And he still pulled the trigger. And she still died on the floor of a boarding house in Dayton, Ohio, while her father blamed her brother. The confession was enough for charges, not for the whole truth. Kenneth had admitted pulling the trigger. Jennifer had confessed the coordinated lie. The room geography had proven their story false. Wyatt had been cleared. The detective had enough to move forward. Enough to charge Kenneth Farler III with killing his daughter, but not enough to make him admit everything. Not enough to make him say he pointed the gun at Kendra, laughed when she begged him to stop, and pulled the trigger anyway. That full truth would never come. Kenneth had drawn his line. He'd give them the trigger, but not the aim. The confession, but not the intent. Enough to convict, not enough to fully own. Kenneth Farler III took a plea deal. No trial, no jury. No courtroom where prosecutors would stand and describe in detail what happened that April afternoon in the boarding house. The plea meant no trial. No one would hear that afternoon described aloud, Kendra's last words. Kenneth laughing. The gun he swore was empty, the lie he built, and the son he framed. The facts would stay in police reports and plea agreements. They would never be spoken in open court for the public to hear. Kenneth Farler III pleaded to charges in the death of his 14-year-old daughter, Kendra Farler. The plea meant no trial. No one would hear that afternoon, described aloud in a courtroom. Kendra's last words, Kenneth laughing. The gun he swore was empty. Justice, but not the full truth. Kenneth Farler III stood before the court and pleaded guilty. No trial. No jury selection. No opening statements or witness testimony. No description of that April afternoon read aloud in open court. Just the plea. Guilty. He pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in the death of Kendra Farler. Guilty to reckless homicide. Guilty to child endangering. Guilty to weapons charges. Kenneth Farler III, 39 years old, admitted in a courtroom in Dayton, Ohio, that he was responsible for the death of his 14-year-old daughter. The plea agreement meant Kenneth would never have to sit through a trial. He would never have to hear prosecutors describe Kendra asking him to put the gun down. He would never have to listen to Jennifer testify about his laughter. He would never have to face a jury who heard every detail of what he did and what he tried to cover up. The plea let him skip all of that. Guilty, yes, but guilty in the quietest possible way. This is how many cases end. Not with the dramatic courtroom scenes people imagine. Not with tearful testimony and a jury's solemn verdict. But with paperwork. With agreements negotiated between lawyers. With a defendant who says the word guilty and avoids everything that word actually means being said aloud. The court moved to sentencing, 25 to 28.5 years. That was the number. That was what the court decided Kenneth Farler III's crime was worth. That was what Kendra Farler's life became in the legal system, a range of years. A sentence with a minimum and a maximum. A number on paper that would determine when Kenneth might walk out of prison and back into the world. 25 years minimum, if he served every day of the minimum sentence. If he was released at the earliest possible moment, Kenneth would be 64 years old. Kendra would have been 39. The age her father was when he killed her. But the maximum was 28.5 years. And parole hearings exist. And prison systems release people early for behavior and overcrowding and 1,000 bureaucratic reasons that have nothing to do with justice. The number was a range, not a guarantee. The minimum was a promise. The maximum was a possibility. The family received justice as a number, not a scene. No dramatic trial where Kendra's story would be told in full. No witness stand where Jennifer would describe Kendra's last words to a silent courtroom. No moment where the truth was spoken aloud for the public record. There was no verdict to hear, because a plea means no verdict. There was only the plea itself. Guilty. And then the number. Kenneth Farler III pleaded guilty to killing Kendra Farler and was sentenced to 25 to 28.5 years. There was no verdict to hear. There was only a number. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Kendra Farler loved teaching people what she learned. She was 14 years old. She loved school. She loved helping people understand things. In that room on April 14, 2024, she tried to teach her father one last thing. The gun was pointed wrong. Put it down. No one listened. 4 days before Kendra died. On April 10th, 2024, a warrant was issued for Kenneth Farler III's arrest for violating his parole. The warrant was active. It was in the system. Kenneth was wanted. All someone had to do was serve it. All someone had to do was knock on the door of the boarding house in Dayton, Ohio, and take Kenneth Farler III into custody. Nobody served it. There is no public record of why. No documentation explaining the delay. No one to ask about the decision not to act on April 10th, or April 11th, or April 12th, or April 13th. The warrant sat in the system while Kenneth stayed free. If they had knocked on that door, if they had taken him into custody, Kendra May Farler would be alive. Why wasn't it served? That question has no answer. The system failed. The warrant existed. Kenneth should have been in custody. Instead, he was in the boarding house with a shotgun on April 14th, and Kendra was standing in front of him, asking him to put it down. Kenneth Farler III chose 2 people he was certain would never speak against him. His 16-year-old son, Wyatt, autistic and nonverbal, who couldn't tell anyone what he'd seen, and his brother Greg, who was asleep upstairs when the gun went off. Kenneth chose the silent and the sleeping because they couldn't refute his lie.
Because he never had a shotgun, you did. Kendra even told you to put it down. It's time to be a man.
They couldn't stand in a courtroom and describe what really happened. They couldn't point at him and say the truth. He was right about Wyatt. The boy's silence just sat there. Wyatt couldn't defend himself. Couldn't tell the police that his father was lying. Couldn't explain that he'd never touched the gun until Kenneth handed it to him after Kendra was already bleeding on the floor. But Greg woke up. Greg came downstairs. Greg answered questions. And when the detective asked Greg about his room, Greg told them the truth. His bedroom was across the hall. The shooting didn't happen in his room. The gun rack wasn't his. The geography broke Kenneth's lie piece by piece, until everyone understood who was left holding the gun. Kenneth chose the silent and the sleeping because they couldn't tell the truth. He was right about the boy, but the brother woke up, and the geography spoke, and Jennifer broke, and the silence sat there until everyone understood who was left holding the gun. Kendra May Farler saw the danger. She stood in her bedroom that morning, choosing what to wear for a Sunday in April. She saw her father with the shotgun. She told him to put it down.
I pushed the lever up. I pumped it 6 times. And normally it ejects all the shells out of it, and it didn't.
She was 14 years old, and she was the only one in that house who understood what was about to happen. And Kendra May Farler was the only one no one listened to. Kendra May Farler's story doesn't end with a number. It ends with a truth we can't ignore. She was 14 years old. She loved teaching. On that Sunday morning in Dayton, Ohio, she tried to teach her father one last lesson. Put the gun down. No one listened. Kendra saw the danger before anyone else. She spoke up. She asked her father to stop. But Kenneth Farler III laughed, pulled the trigger, and then blamed the one person who couldn't speak to defend himself. Listen to the warnings. Believe people when they tell you something's wrong. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a father performing grief for a murder he committed. The system failed Kendra. A warrant sat unserved for 4 days that could have saved her life. We can't change what happened, but we can honor her memory by refusing to ignore the warnings around us. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to Notorious Crimes. Leave a comment. I read every one. If you know someone who needs to hear this, please share it. Thank you for listening. This account is based on a real case, with some scenes dramatized to convey the emotional truth. My deepest respect goes to Kendra Farler's family. May her memory remind us to listen when someone sees danger, even when they're young, even when they're afraid, even when they're the only one speaking up.